You need to know what it's about because it's influencing what's taught in our classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the frightening thing. It's influencing the WHO and the United Nations. It's influencing legislation in our country. This isn't live and let live. That's not what we're talking about anymore. This is you've got to adopt all of this stuff. You've got to be inclusive. This is the modern interpretation of inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
This is the problem with that word. There's very little awareness on what queer theory is. People still think queer means gay people, and hence they recoil when there's any criticism of it because they don't want to criticize their gay friends.
Queer theory has nothing to do with your sexual preference. It's nothing to do with being lesbian or gay. Queer theory is a political movement.
Don't use heteronormative language, right? That's what's promoted by the NCCA and EJA and people like that when they go into schools. You're not to use heteronormative language. This paper is a foundational text of queer theory, along with the writings of Michel Foucault and the writings of people like David Halpern, for example, and Judith Butler. They would all be seen as the founding people of queer theory, and their writings would be such. So this is an insight into queer theory for people who have no knowledge of what queer theory is. If you have no idea what this is all about, you need to know what it's about because it's influencing what's taught in our classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the frightening thing. It's influencing the WHO and the United Nations. It's influencing legislation in our country. It's Thinking Sex Notes for a Radical Theory of Politics and of Sexuality. Now, do you notice the reference to politics here? Because this is political as well. There's a political dimension to this. Um, you can read through it. She talks about lots of things, and we'll have a diagram on the next page, which kind of highlights, I guess, what she covers. This was covered in detail by James Lindsay in a number of podcasts. So I think you should read the paper, but then you probably worthwhile listening to the podcast. Now, it takes a few hours. So you might just read this and some of the things might just go over your head. You mightn't even think what a particular sentence means. You might know the significance of it. So what James Lindsay will do is he'll relate it to other queer theory, aspects of queer theory, other aspects of politics, perhaps, and then put a context on it for you. And you can see it there is part two actually talks about erasing boundaries. And we're going to talk about that because that is one of the key things for queer theory. Queer theory is basically what looks to subvert and overturn the normal or normalcy or heteronormativity, as you know, we would use that term. You've heard that term, heteronormativity. Don't use heteronormative language, right? That's what's promoted by the NCCA and EJA and people like that when they go into schools. You're not to use heteronormative language. That's a queer theory concept, right?
And
So
Eugene,
let's
if I
look at the
can
next.
just jump in, and
Yeah,
this James Lindsay co-authored the book "Queering of the American Child," and I know we've
yeah.
referenced that in a podcast. So some people might prefer to read a paper, some might want a podcast, but there's also the "Queering of the American Child," which is quite a short, easy read as well for more info on
Yeah.
queer theory, because that is what's being pushed into the Irish education system.
The Queering of the American Child kind of summarizes that, brings it together, and puts it in the context of what's happening in American education. And people might think that's way out there. You know, things in America are very different from here, but they're not. They're not. It's coming here. It's coming in here. So it's a worthwhile book to read. So let's look at this. The philosophy of queer theory. You can summarize it in different ways, but one of the ways to look at it is that anything that's normal or what would be perceived as normal is oppressive. Transgressive, which means you're breaking through those boundaries and you're being progressive, if you want to use the term progressive. It's liberating, it's positive, and hence we need to engage with it. We need to engage with it in our schools, etc., in our society. So part of queer theory is activism. So this notion of praxis, you need to put your theory into practice.
And
And that's
Eugene, just for
anybody
anyone who
who's
hasn't tuned in before, just to
yeah,
advise people that queer theory has nothing to do with your sexual preference. It's nothing to do with being lesbian or gay. Queer theory is a political movement, and it would even consider lesbian and gay to be normal. It wants to really push boundaries outside that circle, which we'll talk about in a minute.
yeah, absolutely. I know, you know, a lot of gay people talk about the queer community. And that's kind of a double speak word. The queer community, it could be gay people, because a lot of gay people would say, well, I'm queer, you know, I identify as queer, but they don't identify necessarily, and most of them don't identify necessarily with queer theory. They're basically gay people, and queer would have been a colloquialism used for gay people in the past historically, which they adopted. It was kind of, to be honest, it was a derogatory term. Um, but now you've got this thing called queer theory, for which one reason or another they've chosen to use that language, which is all about transgression, transgressing the norm. Norm is bad, transgression is good. Um, and so it's a call to action. We've got two things here. We've got the charmed circle, which we've shown before, and the outer limits from gay. And this is from this book now, this paper. You'll see this. It might be readable, but if you do a search online, you'll find it. And it talks about sexuality in the charm circle, which is what we'd see as normal. And then you've got the outer limits, which is, you know, multiple people engaged together, intergenerational sex, having sex in the park, in a bathhouse, BDSM, using objects, etc., etc. So it's pushing it, transgressing, right? And then there's another diagram, this figure 2 here, which is probably a more better one because it kind of shows a progression. And you've got the kind of good sex, as I said, which is normative, oppressive construct. So we need to move that. We need to be progressive. We need to move to the right here. And you've got this area of, you know, unmarried couples, heterosexual couples, gay marriage, etc. And, you know, promiscuous gay people in the public park, all this kind of thing, right? So, and I guess some of this is normalized now. A lot of it is normalized now, or seen as normal in our society. Now, people may still not agree with it, etc. Obviously, coming from religious convictions, you wouldn't. But
And
it
Eugene,
has been
I'm looking
normalized
at
to a
this.
large degree.
I'm looking at this charm circle and outer limits, and then the chart with the good sex and the bad sex. And I'm looking at it through the lens of looking at the school curriculum books that we've talked about and the library books. And if we reflect our minds back to the library books, and anyone that missed our podcast released a few days ago, we read from some of those library books. And what we are seeing in the school curriculum and in the library books is actually those outer limits. So we, in some library books, we've seen the manufactured objects, which are sex toys in children's books. We've seen things like S&M. We've seen things like fisting and rimming and all of those things. So, and of course, the transvestites, we now see drag queen story hours for children. So this Gayle Rubin and this outer limits with no boundaries, these adult fetishes are exactly what's being pushed on children in the school curriculum and libraries. This is it right here.
The middle ground there would probably be what we describe as comprehensive sexuality education, but we've been pushed to the right here. You're absolutely correct. So this has been brought mainstreamed into children's education and has been for years in other countries.
Is it any surprise for any listener now? I know we did a podcast the last week about the secrecy pacts, children being asked to keep secrets. We talked about third parties going into schools to teach the nasties. Is it any surprise that they want to keep secrets from parents if they're talking about these adult fetishes and S&M and all of these outer limits in school? I mean, if my child went to a play date and other child's father was talking about these subjects to my child, when my kid came home, I would call the Garda. I would file a complaint. I would have them arrested. So what we would arrest someone for talking to your child about behind the hedge at a playground or at someone's house is being talked about in the classroom. This is state-sponsored child abuse.
You won't see the term queer theory in any school book. You won't. But you'll see things like gender theory, gender ideology, which is part of queer theory. It wasn't really part of Gayle Rubin's thing. She does mention transvestites here, but there was no concept of non-binary when this document was written, for example. That's something that's been socially constructed, if I use that term, in more recent years. Most of that stuff came from Judith Butler and her Gender Trouble book that was published in 1990. That was kind of that was the genesis of the modern day gender theory that we now know today, and that's what's evolved: the socially constructed gender, and all that goes with that. So that wasn't really what Gayle Rubin was into, though she does refer to transvestites, but that was more in the context of people dressing as women, etc., and transsexuals, people who would have a sex operation to change their sex, which is what people used to call, and then it became transgender. So you have to look at the time this book was written, or this paper was written. So what's to the people might ask the question, well, if we want to go further to the right of this chart here, where would I be going? Where you would be going is post-human, transhuman engagement. So you'd be talking about integrating elements of technology into the sexual experience, or whatever. So you'd be going into another dimension again, which would be a post-human, transhuman dimension.
There is a book about transgenderism is leading to the transhumanism. Exactly.
Yeah. I think the other thing I want to maybe highlight here, and it's not really explicitly, it doesn't really come out, but it's the separation of someone's sexuality from a reproductive aspect of human sexuality from the pleasure aspect. And that's what we're seeing happening in schools as well. Sex is for pleasure, which again is a hedonistic construct. And the reproduction stuff is going into a more artificial domain, artificial reproduction, surrogacy, assisted human reproduction, all of that. So they're kind of separating out that aspect of the human being, those two things. And that's something that they're kind of trying to ingrain into children's minds as well, to separate those two constructs. And all the other aspect, obviously they're getting rid of is any notion of marriage and family, which goes with that. So this is the issue. So this isn't just, people might say, oh, well, let people do whatever they want to do. If they want to do it in private, that's fine. Yeah, that's okay. But they're bringing it into schools and they're indoctrinating kids and they're pushing it aggressively. This isn't live and let live. That's not what we're talking about anymore. This is, you've got to adopt all of this stuff. You've got to be inclusive. This is the modern interpretation of inclusion. This is the problem with that word. Is inclusive means everything on figure 2, everything on the circles here that we're showing. That's what inclusion now means. So get that into your mind the next time someone says, oh, this school needs to be inclusive. Do you want to be inclusive of everything that's on this page? Because that's what you're talking about.
And it's really exclusive, or it's bullying to kids who are critical thinkers, who do believe there are only two sexes. It's not including children who have morals and beliefs that sex comes with love and marriage. So it's actually the most uninclusive thing you could imagine. We've had parents contact us and say that their child feels bullied in school. They feel isolated, bullied, and anxious because these things are being taught and it doesn't coincide with their moral conscience, their family values, or their, scientific beliefs.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, in this paper, you'll read it in the paper. Gayle Rubin talks about the fact that boy lovers are excluded, that nobody is speaking up for them. Do you get that? Do people understand what that means? There's very little awareness on what queer theory is. People still think queer means gay people, and hence they recoil when there's any criticism of it because they don't want to criticize their gay friends on their gay uncle or their gay brother or whatever. But that's not what you're criticizing. You're criticizing a pseudo political movement, which is based on sex and gender, which is kind of what it is. This is the agenda. It's pushing against the norm. It's pushing transgression beyond what's healthy. So just be careful. You need to understand what this thing means, because this is influencing people's thought. It's influencing education. It's influencing legislation.